When Sophie Muller, daughter of Bavaria's most powerful automotive supplier, entered the most dilapidated workshop in Unterschleißheim, wearing her dusty pink dress and worn patent leather shoes, no one could have imagined that this girl, who had never spoken a single word in her entire life, would forever change the fate of a man who earned $1,000 a month. Thomas Weber, 32 years old, a mechanic with calloused hands and a heart that had been haunted by tragedy for 5 years, knelt down in front of this blonde girl with blue eyes full of tears and gently asked her what had happened. Sophie did not answer, could not answer, because she had been mute since birth, a condition that the best doctors in Europe had been unable to cure. But when Thomas smiled at her and wiped her tears with an oil-smeared handkerchief, something broke in the silence of this child. And when, 3 months later, in the living room of the Mullers' 20 million villa, Sophie uttered her first word in front of her incredulous parents and astonished doctors, that word was neither mama nor papa, but Thomas. Fate had already decided that this story would remain unforgettable. If you're ready for this story, write in the comments where you're watching this video. Thomas Weber's workshop was not the kind of place where you would expect to find rich children. It was a corrugated iron hall in an industrial area of Unterschleißheim, where the air smelled of motor oil and rusty metal, where the floor was marked by decades of honest but poorly paid work. The walls were papered with old calendars, chaotically hung tools, and faded photos of sports cars that Thomas would never own. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October when Sophie arrived. The sky was gray, as it often is in Bavaria at this time of year. Light rain had begun to fall, and Thomas was lying under a 1996 VW Golf, trying to figure out why the engine was making that strange noise that the owner had described as a crying cat. He heard the doorbell squeak, which he had installed himself because he often didn't hear when someone came in, and crawled out from under the car with a groan. He was expecting a regular customer, perhaps Mr. Schneider with his Passat, which was leaking oil, or Mrs. Hoffman, who always complained that her car smelled, even though Thomas had explained to her 100 times that the problem was her wet dog. Instead, he saw a girl. She was small, maybe 8 years old, with long blonde hair that fell in perfect waves over her shoulders, the kind of hair you see in expensive shampoo commercials. She was wearing a pink dress with white embroidery, now muddy at the knees, and black patent leather shoes that must once have been shiny like mirrors. Her face had an almost unreal beauty, with huge blue eyes that were now red and swollen from crying. She held a small unicorn bag tightly to her chest. Thomas stood up, wiped his hands on his already hopelessly dirty blue overalls, and approached the girl cautiously. It was obvious that she was afraid. Her eyes scanned everything in the workshop as if she had landed on another planet. And in a way, she probably had. A girl dressed like this, with an attitude that screamed privilege and wealth, had never set foot in a place like this before. Thomas knelt down to her level, a gesture he had learned when his daughter was still alive, before the car accident had taken her and his wife away 5 years ago. The pain of that memory was always there, a constant weight on his chest. But he had learned to live with it, to function despite it. He asked her if she was lost, if she needed to call someone, if she was okay. The girl looked at him with those huge eyes. Tears continued to flow silently, but she said nothing. She didn't make a sound. Thomas thought maybe she was too scared to speak, or maybe she was in shock. He noticed that her knees were scraped, small wounds from which a thin trickle of blood was coming. She must have fallen, probably while running away from something or someone. Thomas felt a wave of protectiveness he hadn't felt in 5 years, since his daughter was no longer there to protect. He slowly got up, pointed to a plastic chair in the corner of the workshop where he usually sat and ate his lunch, and motioned for the girl to sit down. She obeyed, her movements cautious, like those of a wild animal ready to flee. Thomas went to the small washroom at the back, a tiny room with a stained sink and a broken mirror, and fetched the first aid kit he kept there. More out of necessity than foresight, as he so often cut or burned himself while working. He returned to the girl and gently cleaned her knees with a disinfectant wipe. She didn't wince in pain, didn't make a sound, just stared at his face with an intensity that Thomas found almost eerie. When he was done, he put bandages on the scratches, bandages with little stars on them that he didn't remember buying, and that had probably been there for years. Then he did the only sensible thing he could think of: call the police. He picked up his cell phone from the other side of the workshop and was about to dial the number when the girl jumped up with surprising agility and grabbed his hand. The force of her grip was desperate. Her eyes begged him not to do it. Even without words, the message was clear: don't call anyone. Thomas hesitated. Every rational instinct told him to call the authorities, that this was clearly a girl who belonged to some wealthy family that was probably searching frantically for her. But something in this girl's eyes, something in her silent desperation, stopped him. He knelt down to her level again and promised her, without really knowing why, that he wouldn't call anyone for the time being, that she could stay here until she was ready to say what had happened. The girl nodded, a lonely tear rolled down her cheek, and for the first time since she had come in, her muscles relaxed slightly. Thomas didn't yet know that this girl's name was Sophie Mueller, that her father Klaus owned half of the automotive suppliers in Bavaria, that her mother Sabine was a famous surgeon who had operated on celebrities and politicians. He didn't know that Sophie had been mute since birth, that her parents had spent millions on medical consultations around the world in search of a cure that didn't exist. He didn't know that Sophie had run away from home that morning because she had heard her parents discussing, through body language and facial expressions, that she had learned to read perfectly. Whether they should send her to a special institute in Switzerland, away from them, where trained professionals could cope with her difficulties better than they could. All Thomas knew was that there was a frightened girl in his workshop, and that for the first time in 5 years, since he had lost his family, he felt he had to protect someone other than himself. The hours passed in the workshop. Sophie sat on the plastic chair and watched Thomas work. He offered her cookies and water, and in the silence he began to talk. He told her about his daughter Emma, who loved dinosaurs at the age of 7 and wanted to be an astronaut. And then he told her about the accident, a truck that didn't stop at a red light, a moment. And his life was broken into two parts: before, when he had a family, and after, when he only had memories. Sophie listened with complete attention. There was understanding in her eyes, as if this 8-year-old girl understood the pain of losing something precious. When it was 6 p.m., Thomas took out a notebook and asked Sophie to write down her name. She wrote in clear handwriting, Sophie. Then hesitantly, she also wrote her parents' phone number. Thomas called. A desperate female voice answered, the voice of a mother who had lost her child. Thomas simply said that Sophie was safe and would be home soon. The woman began to ask 1,000 questions, but he ended the call. He had made a promise to Sophie, and promises to children were sacred. That night, Thomas took Sophie to his apartment in Unterschleißheim, a modest place with photos of Emma and his wife Maria everywhere. Sophie stopped in front of a photo of Emma with ice cream, her face covered in chocolate. Thomas saw her smile for the first time, a small, sad smile. He made spaghetti with tomato sauce and gave her a t-shirt to sleep in. That night, as he lay in his bed, Thomas wondered what the hell he was doing. He knew he had to take her back to her family tomorrow. As he finally drifted into a restless sleep, he dreamed of Emma running with another blonde girl. Both were laughing silently. The next day, Thomas realized he couldn't put it off any longer. He called Sabine Mueller, who cried with relief when she learned her daughter was safe. He gave her the address of the workshop for the afternoon. Sophie looked at him with betrayal in her blue eyes. Thomas gently explained that she had to go home, that her parents loved her. Sophie shook her head vigorously. Tears returned, but Thomas remained firm. At 3 p.m., a black limousine pulled up in front of the workshop. Two people got out. A tall man in his 60s with graying hair, his expression somewhere between relief and anger, and a beautiful woman in her 50s with a wrinkled dress and red tear-stained eyes. Sophie ran into her mother's arms in despair. Sabine fell to her knees and hugged her. Klaus Mueller stood further back, clenched fists, tense jaw. Sabine approached Thomas with gratitude in her eyes and thanked him with a weight that went beyond words. But Klaus came up with a harsh voice, asked why he hadn't called immediately, and threatened to report him. Sophie did something extraordinary. She stood in front of Thomas with her arms outstretched. Her eyes flashed at her father, an 8-year-old girl defending her protector from her millionaire father. Klaus stood there confused. Thomas explained that Sophie had arrived frightened, that he had promised not to call until she was ready, that he had kept her safe and fed, that perhaps, instead of threatening, he should ask himself why his daughter had run away. The silence was heavy. Klaus seemed to shrink. Anger turned to shame. Sabine asked for a private conversation. Sabine explained everything, the motivation since birth, the years of failed attempts, the discussion about the special boarding school. Sophie had heard it and thought her parents wanted to get rid of her. Thomas said something unexpected. Maybe the problem wasn't that Sophie couldn't speak, but that no one had ever really listened to her silence. In 24 hours, he and Sophie had communicated perfectly. He had understood her fear, her need to be seen as a complete person, not as a problem. Sabine cried different tears. Klaus looked at his daughter with new eyes and saw her for the first time as a human being with deep feelings expressed in ways he had never learned to read. Before they left, Sabine asked to stay in touch. Sophie needed people who understood her. Thomas looked at Sophie, who was staring at him hopefully, and said, "Yes, do you like this story? Give it a like and subscribe to the channel." Now let's continue with the video. 3 days later, Sabine called Thomas and invited him to lunch. Sophie hadn't eaten since she came home and had locked herself in her room. But when they showed her a message asking if she wanted to see Thomas, Sophie nodded so vigorously that it seemed she wanted to tear her head off. Thomas drove his old VW Golf to Grunwald. The Mueller's villa was huge with magazine-worthy gardens and an endless driveway. A butler greeted him, a detail Thomas only knew from movies. In the living room, Sophie saw him and ran to him, her face lit up. Lunch was surprisingly pleasant. Klaus and Sabine were genuinely friendly, curious about his life. Thomas talked about Emma and Maria, and they listened respectfully. Sophie sat next to him, finally eating and smiling. In the months that followed, the visits became a Sunday routine. Sophie waited at the window. They spent hours together, communicating in that silent language of gestures and understanding. Thomas taught her practical things, how to change tires, how engines work. She taught him to see the world without relying on words. Klaus and Sabine watched in amazement. Their daughter, always quiet and withdrawn, was now expressive and cheerful. Sabine once said to Thomas with tears in her eyes that he had given them back the daughter they thought they had never had. But the extended Mueller family looked at Thomas suspiciously. What was this poor mechanic doing in their house? What did he really want? Thomas felt their stares and whispers, but he didn't care. He was there for Sophie, the girl who had brought light back into his extinguished life. One Sunday in January, 3 months after their first encounter, the impossible happened. Thomas was in the garden with Sophie, showing her how to build a birdhouse out of recycled wood. It was a cold but clear day. They were working in silence when Sophie put down the hammer and looked at Thomas with a strange expression. She seemed focused, as if she were trying to solve a complicated problem. Thomas asked wordlessly with a questioning look, "What was wrong?" Sophie opened her mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. Her eyes filled with tears of frustration. Thomas understood what she was trying to do, and his heart began to beat wildly. He gently took her hands and said in a calm voice, "You don't have to force yourself." He understood perfectly without words. She was perfect, just the way she was. But Sophie shook her head. She wanted to say something, had to say something. Thomas saw the determination in her eyes, the same fierce determination he had seen when she had defended him in front of her father. And then it happened. A sound came from Sophie's throat. It wasn't a word yet, just a hoarse, strange sound, as if her vocal cords had forgotten how to work. But it was something. It was her voice. Thomas held his breath, didn't dare move, didn't dare hope. Sophie tried again. This time the sound was clearer, though still unformed. Tears ran down her face, not from sadness, but from pure effort, from willpower. And then, with an effort that seemed physically painful, Sophie uttered her first word. It was a simple word, a syllable, but for Thomas, it was as if the heavens had opened. Sophie said in a hoarse and uncertain but unmistakably real voice, "Thomas," she had said his name. After 8 years of silence, the first word she chose to say was his name. Thomas took her in his arms and cried, something he hadn't done since the funeral of his wife and daughter. He cried with disbelief, with something he couldn't even name. Sophie hugged him tightly, crying too, but now she was laughing, a quiet and broken but genuine laugh. When they finally parted, Thomas carried her inside, running, and called for Sabine and Klaus. They hurried out of the living room, alarmed by the urgency in his voice. Thomas feverishly explained what had just happened. Sabine covered her mouth with her hands in disbelief. Klaus turned pale. They asked Sophie to try again. She looked at them, then looked at Thomas, then took a deep breath. With the same enormous effort as before, Sophie said, "Thomas," the same word, this time clearer. Sabine collapsed on the sofa, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Klaus knelt in front of his daughter. Tears ran down his face for the first time that Thomas had ever seen. He tried to get her to say "Daddy," but Sophie shook her head. She was exhausted. That single word had taken everything she had. In the days that followed, the Mullers took Sophie to the best specialists. The doctors were baffled. There was no medical explanation for what had happened. Her vocal cords had always been physically intact. The problem had always been neurological, a blockage that no one could understand or resolve. And suddenly, inexplicably, this blockage had been lifted. The doctors put forward theories. Perhaps delayed maturation, perhaps a neural pathway had finally formed, perhaps positive emotional stress, but no one really knew. All they knew was that Sophie Muller had been mute since birth, and she continued to improve. Every day a new word, every week a more complex sentence. But there was something that everyone noticed, something that no one spoke aloud for weeks. Sophie only spoke when Thomas was present. With her parents, with the doctors, with anyone else, she remained silent. But as soon as Thomas entered the room, her voice returned, hoarse and imperfect, but unmistakably present. A year passed since Sophie's first word. It was a year of small and big miracles, progress and setbacks, hope and frustration. Sophie attended speech therapy 3 times a week, worked with specialized teachers, practiced every day. Her voice grew stronger, clearer, though it always retained that hoarse quality that would remain forever, a reminder of her long silence. But the real miracle was not that Sophie had found her voice. It was that Thomas had found his reason for living again. For years after the death of his family, he had barely functioned, existing but not living. Sophie had given him back a purpose, a reason to wake up in the morning with something resembling hope. Klaus and Sabine saw this change in Thomas and wanted to reward him. They offered to buy his workshop and turn it into a luxury car dealership with him as the director. They offered money, a house, investments, but Thomas refused everything. He didn't want to be in their debt, didn't want his relationship with Sophie to be contaminated by financial transactions. What he did accept, however, was their friendship. Real friends, not a poor mechanic and a rich family, but people who cared about each other. They ate dinner together, laughed together, shared stories and pain. Klaus confessed to Thomas his fears of being a bad father, of almost sending his daughter away because he didn't know how to love her properly. Thomas shared his still raw pain over the loss of his family and how Sophie had filled a void he thought would remain empty forever. When Sophie turned 2 years after that first encounter in the workshop, her birthday party was split in two. A big party at the Muller's mansion with all the rich kids of her world, full of expensive decorations and professional entertainers, and a small celebration in Thomas's workshop, where Sophie had invited only 3 people, her parents and Thomas. In the workshop, they ate cake bought at the supermarket and drank lemonade from plastic cups. Sophie, her voice now almost normal, though retaining that special quality, told the story of how she had met Thomas. She told how frightened she had been that day, how she had heard her parents talking about the Interat and thought they didn't want her anymore. And then she told them how this friendly stranger with oil-smeared hands had treated her as if she were valuable, as if her silence were not a defect, but just a different way of being. Sabine and Klaus listened to their daughter speak, still amazed every time they heard her voice, still grateful for the miracle they had thought impossible. When Sophie finished her story, she did something that left everyone speechless. She approached Thomas and told him that when she grew up, she wanted to be like him. She didn't want to be rich or famous or powerful. She wanted to be kind. She wanted to be the kind of person who sees someone in need and stops to help, who judges people not by what they have, but by who they are. She wanted to be someone who made people feel seen and valued, just as Thomas had done for her. Thomas couldn't speak. Tears prevented him from forming words. So he did the only thing he could. He hugged this extraordinary girl who had changed his life just as he had changed hers, and whispered in her ear that she already was that person and always would be. Years later, when Sophie was a teenager and then a young woman, she went to university to study speech therapy because she wanted to help other children like her. When she graduated with honors and her parents cried with pride, there was always one man in the audience who applauded louder than anyone else. A man with hands still marked by grease because he still worked in his small workshop, because that was who he was and he didn't want to change. Sophie always said that Thomas Weber had saved her life that day in the workshop, but Thomas knew the truth. They had saved each other. She had reminded him that loving life means loving it even when life is scary because you could lose it again. And he had taught her that silence does not mean teaching and that sometimes the most important words are those we never say out loud, but live every day through our actions. The story of Sophie and Thomas became a legend in their little corner of Bavaria. People talked about the mute girl who had found her voice thanks to a poor mechanic with a heart of gold. But those who knew the true story knew that it wasn't about medical miracles or social classes colliding. It was about something much simpler and much rarer. It was about seeing another human being, really seeing them, and deciding to care for them, not because of what they could give you in return, but because kindness is its own reward. And in a world that too often measures value in terms of money and possessions, that was the most valuable lesson of all. If this story makes you believe that kindness can still change the world, leave a little heart below to let me know. And if you really want to support stories like this, which speak of real people with real hearts in a world that often forgets what really matters, you can leave a little thank you from the bottom of your heart using the super like feature below. Every gesture counts, just like Thomas's gesture when he knelt down in front of a frightened girl and decided to see her. Because you decided to stay until the end, and that makes you just as special as the protagonist of this story.